Drumintee, South Armagh, Saturday the 14th of May 1977. A pub called the Three Steps Inn. It's a busy night. There is music. A man comes in on his own. Dark-haired, well-built, mid to late 20s, brown leather jacket, jeans. He drinks a pint of Guinness, plays some pool, talks to people. At some point in the evening he gets up and sings with the band. He is a captain in the Grenadier Guards. His name is Robert Nairac. He is 28 years old, educated at Ampleforth and Oxford, and he has 4 boxing blues from university. This is his 4th tour of Northern Ireland, and he is operating in one of the most hostile environments in Western Europe for a British soldier. Alone, in civilian clothes, with no backup within reach. He left Bessbrook Mill Army base at 9:25 that evening. He radioed his presence at the pub just before 10. He was due back by 11:30. Sometime after 11, he was followed out to the car park. There was a fight. He was a strong man, and he didn't go easily. He was overpowered. His 9mm Browning pistol was taken, and he was put into a car and driven a few miles south across the border into County Louth. He was taken to a field near Ravensdale, close to a bridge over the Flurry River. He was beaten. He was interrogated. He was shot. His body has never been found. That has been true for 48 years. There have been searches, Garda investigations, and deathbed claims. In August 2024, the Independent Commission for the Location of Victims' Remains conducted an excavation on private farmland in the Forehart area of County Louth, the first focused official search since 1977. It found nothing. On 13th of February 1979, the London Gazette published the posthumous award of the George Cross to Captain Robert Lawrence Nairac of the Grenadier Guards. And in the years since, Nairac has become something no other individual of the entire conflict became. Not a soldier, not a casualty, but a contested figure that every side has shaped differently. A name that appears on war memorials and in collusion theories, sometimes in the same paragraph. Understanding what actually happened and what remains genuinely unknown requires separating 3 categories of evidence and holding the line between them throughout. First, what is established by court record, meaning criminal conviction. Second, testimony, meaning named accounts from witnesses, court-adjacent statements, and attributed journalism. Third, claim, meaning allegations and posthumous reconstructions that can't be traced to any court or sworn record. Those 3 categories matter because almost everything about Robert Nairac, except the convictions and the citation, falls into the second or third. Robert Lawrence Nairac was born in Mauritius on 31st of August 1948. His father, Maurice, was a Catholic ophthalmologist of French Mauritian origin. His mother, Barbara, was Anglican English. The family settled in England not long after his birth, Maurice Nairac taking a consultant post at Sunderland Eye Infirmary. Robert was the youngest of 4 children. He attended preparatory school at Gilling Castle, which feeds directly into Ampleforth College, the Catholic boarding school in North Yorkshire. At Ampleforth, he was head of his house, excelled academically, played rugby and boxed. He also became close friends with the sons of Lord Killannin and went to stay with the family in Dublin and in Connemara, his first real contact with Ireland as a place rather than a concept. At Lincoln College, Oxford, he read medieval and military history and graduated with a 2.1 in 1971. He won 4 blues for boxing. He revived the university's amateur boxing club, captained the team, and was instrumental in saving the varsity match against Cambridge. He was also a falconer, keeping a hawk in his rooms at Lincoln, the same bird, reportedly, used in the 1969 film Kes. After Oxford, he entered Sandhurst under the sponsorship of the Grenadier Guards. was commissioned into the regiment on graduation, and then completed postgraduate studies in Irish history at Trinity College, Dublin, before joining his unit. The Irish dimension, in other words, was part of his formation before he ever patrolled a Belfast street. Multiple biographical accounts describe his interest as genuine: the language, the traditional music, the history. Supporters later said it made him effective in building contacts. Critics said it made him reckless about the risks of the environment he was trying to penetrate. Both framings carry some truth, and neither should be treated as the whole story. His first Northern Ireland tour was with the 2nd Battalion Grenadier Guards, stationed in Belfast from July to October 1973, working the Shankill Road and the Ardoyne. He stayed on after the tour ended as liaison officer for the replacement battalion. Then, rather than follow his regiment to Hong Kong, he volunteered for military intelligence duties and returned in 1974, attached to 14 Intelligence Company, the Army's specialist covert surveillance unit, known as 14 INT. He was promoted to captain on the 4th of September 1975. By his 4th tour, posted to Bessbrook Mill in South Armagh, he held the formal designation of Liaison Officer at Headquarters 3 Infantry Brigade. The George Cross citation, the only official document in existence that describes his service, states his task was connected with surveillance operations. That is the entirety of what is officially recorded about the operational content of his work. One correction worth making explicitly: Nairac wasn't a member of the SAS. Jeff Knupfer of the Independent Commission for the Location of Victims' Remains has stated this clearly and on the record. He worked alongside SAS personnel, knew SAS men individually, and operated in an adjacent role. He was a Grenadier Guards officer attached to Brigade Intelligence. The SAS designation is one of the first mythological layers applied to his story, and getting it wrong distorts everything that follows. There is a question that sits underneath the entire story of that night at the 3 Steps Inn. How were undercover British soldiers supposed to handle accents in South Armagh in 1977? Answering that honestly requires understanding the ground. By 1977, South Armagh had specific operational characteristics that set it apart from other theatres. The IRA's South Armagh unit had inflicted enough casualties through ambushes, roadside bombs, and sniping that the British Army had largely shifted to helicopter movement for personnel in significant parts of the area. Foot patrols in deep Republican villages carried a risk level that shaped tactical decisions from the brigade level down. Merlin Rees's phrase, "bandit country," described something operationally real about the terrain and the threat. The standard response to the accent problem for covert operators was, in essence, to avoid the situation altogether. Most 14 INT operators worked with cover identities that fitted their actual accents. Someone with a Northern English accent would present as a Northern Englishman passing through on legitimate business. Operations were conducted primarily from vehicles. Personal infiltration of deep Republican social environments, walking into pubs on Saturday nights, performing, sustaining a cover story that required intimate local knowledge, wasn't standard practice. Local intelligence was developed through handlers and existing sources, not through cold personal exposure in areas where a stranger's face would be noted and remembered. Former SAS man Ken Connor, one of those involved in creating 14 INT, wrote of Nairac before his death that he appeared to have been allowed to get out of control, deciding himself what tasks he would do, and that nobody seemed to know who his boss was. That observation matters for what came next. Nairac is remembered precisely because he was the exception. The exception killed him. Now to the night itself, where the evidentiary discipline matters most, because the gap between the popular account and the court record is widest here. Court record establishes the following. Nairac was abducted from the car park of the Three Steps Inn, Drumintee, County Armagh. He was transported across the border to the Flurry Bridge area of Ravensdale in County Louth. He was murdered there by Liam Townsend on or about 15 May 1977. His damaged Triumph Dolomite was left abandoned in the pub car park. His body was never recovered. These facts come from Townsend's 1977 conviction in Dublin and were confirmed and relied upon in the 2011 Belfast Crown Court proceedings against Kevin Krilly. The 2011 judgment also records that the car park and surrounding area were designated as multiple assault scenes and that Krilly himself, in a covert interview with BBC Spotlight journalists, described what he witnessed at the car park as a battle. That is the court-established record of events. Testimony from named sources and accounts given after the fact adds the following. Nairac arrived at the pub presenting himself as a Belfast Republican. According to multiple accounts, he gave his name as Danny McCurlane, describing himself as a motor mechanic and a member of the official IRA from the Ardoyne area of North Belfast. The real Danny McCurlane was an actual official IRA member from Ardoyne who had been on the run since 1974 and who was later killed by the Provisional IRA in June 1978. According to the same accounts, Nairac sang with the pub band. The songs most commonly named are The Broad Black Brimmer and The Boys of the Old Brigade. He bought rounds. He talked to people. None of this, the alias, the cover story, the songs, appears in any court judgment. It comes from journalism, from accounts given years after the night, and from secondary biographical sources. It's broadly consistent across those sources, but its precise form is unverifiable against the court record. The specific mechanism by which his cover broke is where the evidence flaw becomes thinnest. The widely repeated claim is that Nairac used a Belfast accent that locals found unconvincing, that this was noticed, and that the accent was the decisive trigger for his identification. The 2011 Belfast Crown Court proceedings don't record any witness testimony identifying accent as the cause. A named witness, Terry McCormick, a Belfast boxer who was present in the pub that night, is cited in secondary sources as having said that Nairac's accent didn't sound like a genuine Ardoyne accent. That account comes from a single secondary source, not from sworn testimony in any court that examined the case. McCormick died in September 2021. What is established is simpler than the popular account. The men in that pub concluded Nairac wasn't who he claimed to be. He was followed out to the car park. McCormick, by several accounts, punched him, heard a metallic sound that suggested a concealed weapon, and called others to help. A British Army patrol was positioned not far from the pub, but Nairac was unable to reach them on the radio he was carrying. After a prolonged struggle, he was overpowered and forced into a car. The car drove south across the border, a matter of a few miles. At Ravensdale, in the north of County Louth, Nairac was interrogated through the early hours of the morning. The George Cross citation states he was subjected to a succession of exceptionally savage assaults in an attempt to extract information which would have put other lives and future operations at serious risk. It records that these efforts to break Captain Nairac's will failed entirely. It records that he made repeated and spirited attempts to escape. He didn't tell them who he was or what he knew. Liam Townsend shot him. Townsend was 24 years old, from the village of May near Newry. His first statement to the Gardaí, made around the time of his arrest, began, "I shot the British captain. He never told us anything. He was a great soldier. The Gardaí began searching the Ravensdale area almost immediately. Bloodstains and bullets were found near a stream. After 4 days, the Garda Síochána confirmed to the RUC that they had reliable evidence of Nairac's killing. His body wasn't found. Townsend was arrested on 28th of May 1977 at a farmhouse near Dundalk and made 2 admissible confessions at Dundalk Garda Station, the second after consulting a solicitor. Court record. On 8th of November 1977, the Special Criminal Court in Dublin, a 3-judge, non-jury tribunal, convicted Liam Townsend of the murder of Captain Robert Nairac on or about 15th of May 1977 in County Louth, and of possession of a .32 revolver and ammunition with intent to endanger life. The court stated it had no discretion in the matter of sentencing and imposed penal servitude for life. Townsend served approximately 13 years before his release around 1990. His appeal was unsuccessful. In 1978, the RUC arrested 5 men from South Armagh. The case was heard by Lord Justice Gibson at the Belfast City Commission, a non-jury court. Court record. Gerard Fearon was convicted of the murder of Robert Lawrence Nairac on a date unknown between the 13th day of May 1977 and the 16th day of May 1977 in the Republic of Ireland. He was also convicted of possessing Nairac's Browning semi-automatic pistol with intent to endanger life and of causing grievous bodily harm with intent. He received a life sentence. Thomas Morgan was also convicted of murder and sentenced to life. He died in a road accident in 1987, a year after his release. Daniel O'Rourke was acquitted of murder but convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years. Michael McCoy received 5 years for kidnapping. Owen Rocks received 2 years for withholding information. 6 men convicted across 2 jurisdictions, 3 for murder. That is the firmest cluster of facts this story contains. Kevin Krilly came later. He was arrested by the PSNI on 20th of May 2008, aged 57, in County Armagh. He had spent nearly 30 years in the United States and returned to Northern Ireland under an alias. He was charged with murder, kidnapping, false imprisonment, unlawful detention, and failing to give information in the period 14 to 17th May 1977. The prosecution's theory was that Krilly had transported Townsend to the location where Nairac was being held, making him a secondary party to murder. The prosecution's 2 principal pieces of evidence were Townsend's 1977 Garda confession and Krilly's own admissions to BBC Spotlight journalists in a covert interview, in which he acknowledged being at the 3 Steps car park that night and driving Townsend to an unspecified location. In January 2011, the court ruled that Townsend's Garda confession couldn't be used against Krilly. The legal basis was the principle established in Cadder v. Lord Advocate, that admission of the untested confession would have such an impact on the fairness of this trial that it had to be excluded. Without that evidence, the prosecution's case couldn't be made out to the required standard. On the 1st of April 2011, Mr. Justice McLaughlin acquitted Krilly on all 5 charges. His judgment states, "The prosecution hasn't proved beyond reasonable doubt the state of knowledge or intention necessary to transform the transporting of Liam Townsend by Krilly to an unspecified place at an unspecified time into a knowing participation in a potential murder. For these reasons, I find the accused not guilty." The judgment also noted that Krilly's BBC admissions proved involvement to some degree, that he was at the car park, that he witnessed the battle, that he drove Townsend. Witnessing isn't the same as participating, and participation was what the prosecution couldn't prove to criminal standard once the confession was excluded. That is the limit of what courts established. Not the full sequence of events, not complete individual accountability for everyone present. 6 convictions, 1 acquittal on evidential grounds, and a judgment that explicitly stated it couldn't determine where Nairac was being held at the moment Krilly drove Townsend, or when the decision to kill him was made, or by whom. In the years after 1977, accelerating as the peace process created space for historical re-examination, Nairac's name began appearing in a different category of account entirely. Not as a victim, but as an agent, specifically as a British intelligence officer who had worked alongside loyalist paramilitaries in acts of collusion. 2 allegations surface repeatedly. Both need to be stated, sourced, and rated honestly. The first concerns the Miami showband attack of 31st July 1975. 3 members of the band, Fran O'Toole, Tony Geraghty, and Brian McCoy, were shot and killed by the UVF's Mid-Ulster Brigade on the A1 road at Buskill in County Down, after being stopped at a bogus army checkpoint in the early hours of the morning. 2 UVF men, Wesley Somerville and Harris Boyle, also died when a bomb they were planting on the band's minibus detonated prematurely. 2 musicians survived, Stephen Travers and Des Lee. The UVF men involved included members of the Ulster Defence Regiment simultaneously serving in the security forces. The Historical Inquiries Team review of 2011 confirmed Robin Jackson's involvement via fingerprints and ballistics. Collusion between security forces and loyalist paramilitaries in this attack isn't in serious historical dispute. What is disputed is whether Robert Nairac played any role in organising or directing it. The allegation linking Nairac specifically to the Miami attack derives primarily from Fred Holroyd, a former British Army military intelligence officer. Holroyd claimed Nairac organised the attack in cooperation with Jackson and the Mid-Ulster UVF. In July 2025, on the 50th anniversary of the massacre, Des Lee published a memoir claiming Nairac was responsible from start to finish in its planning. Steve Travers, the other survivor, testified that an English-accented officer appeared to be overseeing the attack, but stated he was uncertain whether the man was Nairac, noting the individual had fair hair while Nairac's was dark. The Barron report, examining Dublin and Monaghan bombing-related collusion allegations, referenced Nairac's alleged links to loyalist paramilitaries, but didn't establish his presence at the Miami attack. The Historical Inquiries Team review didn't find conclusive evidence that Nairac was present or directed the attack. The British Army's stated position is that Nairac was in Scotland at the time. Jeff Knupfer of the ICLVR has stated publicly there is ample evidence that Nairac wasn't in Ireland, north or south, when the attack occurred. Why intelligent, informed people believe this allegation anyway? Because collusion between British security forces and loyalist paramilitaries in this period is separately and firmly established in other documented cases. The same UVF networks allegedly linked to Nairac demonstrably carried out the Miami attack. If collusion happened elsewhere, and it did, then asking whether Nairac was part of it's a legitimate historical question. That question, though, isn't the same thing as an answer. No inquiry that examined the Miami allegation specifically found substantiating evidence placing Nairac there. The second allegation concerns the killing of John Francis Green on the 10th of January 1975. Green was a senior IRA figure shot dead at a farmhouse near Castle Blaney in County Monaghan. The killing was claimed by the Mid-Ulster UVF. Later investigations linked it to the Glenanne gang network. Fred Holroyd's central claim is that Nairac showed him a colour Polaroid photograph of Green's body and stated he had been present when Green was shot. The Barron report examined this directly. Its finding? The evidence before the inquiry that the Polaroid photograph, allegedly taken by the killers after the murder, was actually taken by a Garda officer on the following morning seriously undermines the evidence that Nairac himself had been involved in the shooting. If the photograph was taken by a Garda officer 12 to 20 hours after Green's death, Nairac couldn't have shown it to Holroyd as evidence of his own presence at the scene shortly afterwards. The Home Secretary's written answer to Parliament in 1989 confirmed that the RUC had investigated the allegation and found no evidence to support it. Jeff Knupfer stated that Nairac was some 80 miles away in Derry at the time of Green's assassination. Neither allegation is established. Neither can be stated as fact. Dismissing the people who believe them would be a mistake, because the ground from which both grow, real, documented, convicted collusion by security force members operating in the same networks and the same period, is genuine. The belief is rooted in something real. Applying that real context to Nairac specifically is where the evidence stops supporting the conclusion. Returning now to the original question, how did undercover British soldiers handle accents in South Armagh? Most of them handled the problem by not creating it in the first place. Cover identities were fitted to operators' actual accents. Vehicle-based operations reduced personal exposure in deep Republican areas. Local sourcing ran through handlers and existing contacts, not through cold personal infiltration of Republican pubs on busy Saturday nights with cover stories that required intimate local knowledge to sustain. The architecture of Nairac's cover that night was intricate in a way that created multiple points of failure. He was using the identity of a specific real person, a named official IRA member from a specific part of Belfast, in a pub in South Armagh, an area with Republican networks that had connections to Belfast. The real Danny McCurlane had been on the run since 1974. Whether someone in that pub knew what McCurlane actually sounded like, or knew his whereabouts, or simply knew he wasn't there, that alone would have been enough. The accent may or may not have been convincing. No court record says either way. What the court record says is that men in that pub concluded Nairac wasn't who he said he was, and acted on that conclusion. The wrong accent version of the story is neat. It has a satisfying cause and effect logic. Bad accent, blown cover, death. It's also the version with the least evidentiary grounding. Myth takes a complex failure and reduces it to a single memorable explanation, something you can put in a headline. The honest version is less clean. An exceptional officer with a genuine and documented interest in Ireland, operating in the most hostile environment in these islands, without adequate oversight, made a series of judgments about his own capability to manage a situation that the situation ultimately didn't support. Ken Connor had written of that risk before the night even happened. Nobody who could have stopped him did. That isn't a character verdict, it's what the record shows. The George Cross citation, published in the London Gazette on 13th February 1979, is the only official document that describes what Robert Nairac did in Northern Ireland. The Queen approved the posthumous award to Captain Robert Lawrence Nairac, service number 493007, Grenadier Guards. The citation records 4 tours totaling 28 months. It speaks of his quick analytical brain, resourcefulness, physical stamina, and above all, his courage and dedication. Of the night of 14th May 1977, it says he was abducted from a village in South Armagh by at least 7 men. It records that these efforts to break Captain Nairac's will failed entirely. It states he made repeated and spirited attempts to escape. It concludes his assassin subsequently said, "He never told us anything." The citation describes his task as connected with surveillance operations. There is no specific operation named, no informant network recorded, no unit named beyond 3 Brigade, no detail of any individual action. The document is simultaneously the foundation of the martyr narrative and, by what it leaves unrecorded, a demonstration of how thin the official record actually is. It wasn't designed to reveal, it was designed to honour. The gap between those two purposes is exactly where the mythology grew. 3 conditions together manufacture a myth of this specific kind. First, a figure who operated in an environment where the thing being alleged genuinely occurred elsewhere. Documented collusion, real cooperation between security force members and loyalist paramilitaries. Nairac operated in precisely that environment. Second, a figure who left almost no official paper trail. The units involved in this kind of work in 1977 didn't generate the records that later become publicly available, and much of what exists comes from accounts given afterwards by people with reasons to shape them. Third, and this is the element that distinguishes the Nairac case from every other disputed figure of the conflict, he can't speak in his own defence, or in anyone else's, because his body hasn't been found. No file, no body, no possibility of him ever saying anything to anyone again. Every allegation made against Robert Nairac has been made in that specific combination of conditions. The absence of documentation does not prove the allegations true, but it can't prove them false in the way that a complete record would. The argument continues because the conditions that enable it haven't changed. The searches continue too. He is listed by the Independent Commission alongside Columba McVeigh, Joe Linsky and Seamus Maguire. 4 disappeared cases without recovered remains. In the spring of 2025, an IRA source was quoted as saying his body would never be located. The fort excavation of 2024 found nothing. There is still a field in County Louth that people go back to. There are 2 Robert Nairacs available, and both of them are useful to somebody. There is the one on the War Memorial, Ampleforth and Oxford, the George Cross, the officer who walked into the worst place in Western Europe on his 4th tour and, when the worst happened, didn't talk. The citation says, "He never told us anything." Townsend said the same thing in different words before he said anything else. And there is the other one, the name attached to every collusion theory, the shadow in the background of every unexplained loyalist killing between 1974 and 1977. The English officer in the bar who didn't quite fit, doing something that no document will specify. The evidence for the first is a citation. The evidence for the second is mostly an absence. He became the most argued-over man of the entire conflict, not because we know so much about him, but because we know so little. No file, no record, no body, and no possibility of him saying a word in his own defence or against anyone else. 48 years later, the excavations continue, and the argument continues with them. What do you think he was doing in that pub? If this is the kind of story you come here for, subscribe.